now we come to the first and main subject, disgusting. That's the exact word used by US President Donald Trump to describe Russia's recent strikes on Kyiv. As the world runs out of words of condemnation and diplomatic efforts seem to be failing, will geopolitics swing the outcome of the conflict? How will Donald Trump's plans to impose sanctions on Moscow and its trading partners impact Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision-making? Here with me to share his insight is Mark Toth, national security and foreign policy political analyst. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Anna, thank you. Thank you for having me back on.
New sanctions would be implemented within about 8 days. That's according to Donald Trump, but Trump himself voiced some doubts about their effectiveness. Are sanctions too little too late now? What's your perception on the situation? Is a longer war in Ukraine becoming a new reality?
I think at this point, there's two ways to look at it. One, they're helpful in the sense of any dollars, any rubles that are denied to Putin is a good thing. It stops him from using those to fund his war in Ukraine. That said, it's too late. In terms of stopping what Putin is doing in Ukraine, this continual targeting of Ukrainian civilian targets, this basic 900-mile front line that's basically become a war of attrition that he's continuing, is not going to stop unless Ukraine gets added military aid that enables it to go on the offensive against Putin. So sanctions can help. Certainly the secondary sanctions in particular can help, especially because those interdict trade that happens between nations. The U.S. can disrupt that on the global markets in terms of transactions. So from that standpoint, countries like India that try to purchase Russian oil, that can have good effects. But I don't think at the end of the day it's going to have the intended effect that that Trump wants, which is causing Putin to end this war. So they're helpful, but they're not decisive.
Believe it or not, and that's quoting Donald Trump, his special envoy, Michael Witkoff, has been dispatched to Moscow again. So far, his visits to Moscow and talks with Vladimir Putin have brought no tangible results. So in your view, is Witkoff to blame, or is Putin simply deceiving the American president?
Yeah, I think Witkoff, when he goes, hears what he wants to hear as opposed to hears what Putin is basically saying. And I don't think you can look at what Putin is saying in these meetings. You've got to look at Putin's actions on the battlefield. So, for instance, every time one of these meetings happens between Witkoff, every time one of these phone calls happens between Donald Trump and Putin himself, as noted by Melania Trump, the First Lady of the United States, Putin then goes back out after saying, yep, no, we can make progress, we can pursue peace, etc. He goes back out and he continues his bombing campaign against Ukrainian civilians and the like. He's not curtailing anything in the war, not giving the U.S. any sign, any indication that he truly means peace, that he truly wants to pursue any kind of negotiation that's substantive. So I think in this case, okay, Witkoff's back. But I think he's going to hear more of the same. It'll be some kind of vague notion that, well, sure, we can resume some type of negotiations. We'll set them for some point in the future, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about this again. But it's just kabuki theater. It's just redux of what we've already heard, which is basically Russia saying, well, think about peace. Meanwhile, we're going to continue our war.
Right, so pundits differ in their opinions, obviously. I myself was convinced by an Applebaum recently, who says that Putin has to be convinced that the war cannot be won. The war is hopeless, basically. So do you share this view? What will it take to force Putin to stand down?
I do, and you're wise to take that view, because we're at a point where the negotiation process has been going on since Trump took office. It's led to nowhere. We're no closer to any kind of deal, any substantive deal that gets us closer to peace. And the just enough approach, one that began with Biden in his administration of giving Ukraine just enough to defend itself, but not enough to stop the war against it, hasn't worked. And so until Putin comes to believe, as Applebaum said, and as you noted, and as your own conviction is, until he comes to believe that he cannot win this war, nothing is substantially going to change. But that's going to take a change in Washington's thinking. It can't just be defensive weapons, which we've seen to date. Even this latest round was highly defensive, the 17 Patriot missile batteries that are earmarked for Ukraine. Those are great. Those can protect civilian infrastructure. It can be pushed up into the forward parts of the battlefield and helping the Ukrainian forces as well. But much more is needed. JASSMs, for instance, these are surface-to-air missiles that are fired from F-16s that can go 200 miles, can reach Moscow and interdict things there. They can take out the Kerch Bridge. The Taurus missile, for instance, from Germany is needed. A rethinking is much needed among the lines of NATO, because this isn't going to work unless Ukraine is given these offensive type capabilities so that they can go after the Russian archers, meaning the people that fire these weapons, and not continually just defend against them. Because all this has done is created this war of attrition that we've seen that's slowly starting to give way, and Ukraine keeps losing territory, albeit small parts at a time, a kilometer a day. It's not significant. It's not going to cause them to lose the war, but it just tells you that it's not going to let them win it either and put an end to the dying.
So there's much more to be used still. But coming back to Washington's thinking, as you mentioned, Donald Trump's apparently getting frustrated with the limited success of his diplomatic efforts. He also distanced himself from the conflict by calling it Biden's war. So what motivation does the U.S. president have at this point to end the Russian aggression?
Yeah, I think at this point, his worldview is getting pushed back in terms of Putin. He thought that he could come in, that he could sideline this war and end it. And then basically there are people in his administration, people like Elbridge Colby, even the vice president, J.D. Vance, that believes that somehow you could peel Russia off and then use them in some kind of fight to contain, to deter China in the Indo-Pacific. That just simply hasn't worked. And I think that's why you've seen such a long timeline here where Trump has tried to make that happen. But he's starting to recognize that Putin is not going to be peeled off, that he's going to continue this partnership with Xi Jinping, the president of China, and that no amount of peace efforts on the part of the U.S. are going to work. So I think for him, it really is, it's coming to face reality. Initially, he had given Putin 50 days, which would have taken us to after Labor Day, a major holiday here in the U.S. But now he's shortened that to the 10 to 12 days. And so we're looking at somewhere around August 8th, if you will, where these sanctions could be put in place. I do think you're going to see Trump follow through on this. He needs to. He's given his word that he has. Putin will try to get out of it. He'll certainly try to negotiate, call for talks, with Witkoff being there in Moscow and the like. But unless Trump starts backing up his words, Putin isn't going to change anything, and this war will continue.
Well, that's a view shared also by retired General David Petraeus, who commanded U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. According to him, a ceasefire in Ukraine is only likely when Western aid enables Kyiv to shift the battlefield dynamic. So apart from the help of United States, what can Europe do?
Right, and I'd quickly really reiterate your words there about General Petraeus. My writing colleague, Colonel John Sweet, had served under him multiple times, and definitely General Petraeus is right. This is the only way forward that the West has in terms of stopping this war. So, I think that's important. And I apologize, I lost your question there.
Yes, right. I was asking you about Europe's efforts, because you spoke at large about American weapons to be used. How about Europe? What can we do here?
Yeah, and my apologies. I was focused on General Petraeus there. Europe needs to do a lot more. I think the biggest threat is to Europe in terms of what Putin would do next in the Baltic states, to Poland, et cetera. And I think one of the things that they can do is what Zelensky just called for, starting to interdict this fleet. That 70% of the oil that Russia trades through its shadow fleet goes through the Baltic Sea. that's something tangible that Europe can be doing right away to put a stop to that. And that would put a huge negative in terms of cash flow that Putin is getting to fund his war, would stop these illegal oil sales from happening. Europe can also push forward things like the Taurus missile that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That could take out the Kerch Bridge, which would be a very tactical, useful operation in terms of isolating Crimea and making it difficult for Putin to resupply his troops that today are still striking Kherson in southern Ukraine and creating threats there. Russian forces are going after a key bridge there. Why not enable them through the Taurus missile, et cetera, from Europe to do that elsewhere? So I think the same messaging that I have for the Trump administration to do more militarily in terms of offensive weapon capabilities is the same thing for Europe. And I think if they can get behind that, if they can realize that Ukraine is willing to fight this fight, they are fighting this fight, and they can give them the weapons to win this fight, that'll stop European nations from having to send your own young sons and daughters into battle at some future point with Putin.
And lastly, there's, of course, one last element of this puzzle. Convinced that he's winning the war, Vladimir Putin's response to negotiation efforts has been reserved, to say the least. But is he right? What's the situation on the ground, and how resilient is actually the Russian economy?
Yeah, I think anytime you have a dictator, to take your second part first, in charge of an economy, he's turned it into a war economy. So he has staying power there. You know, Germany, up until that third quarter during the Second World War, was able to keep its military production at an all-time high. And Putin is going to be able to do that because he's got Xi supporting him behind the scenes. We've seen a lot of dual-use technology from China already on the battlefield. And now we're just seeing outright Chinese production of things that are showing up on the battlefield. Ukraine's done a good job of identifying that. So from an economy standpoint, I know it's dire, it's implosive, it's a bubble that could easily burst once the war is over. But I think as long as this war is continuing, and as long as Xi Jinping is willing to back them with the money and supplies, it's not going to implode anytime soon. In terms of the battlefield itself, look, it's dynamic now. It's not a static battlefield, but it's happening at a foot's pace. I wrote about this the other day in Washington, D.C., where these aren't sweeping maneuvers yet of large, 50-mile gains in a day, but it's basically a foot soldier. And the tactics are changing. Instead of Russia attacking the Donetsk fortress, if you will, they're going around it with 8 different supporting salients, where they're using squads with just motorcycle guys, 3-5 to a group, probing weaknesses in the Ukrainian front lines and then massing there to try to do gains. But again, we're talking a square kilometer a day, nothing significant. But incrementally, they're starting to take territory. And just to put a bow on that, if this war in Trump's mind is all about the rare earth minerals and this deal that he struck, every square kilometer that they take, including, for instance, that 100-acre lithium mine that Russia took several weeks back, is taking rare earth minerals off the table and putting them in Putin's pocket as opposed to the West. And so that needs to be reversed.
Thank you so much. Mark Toth, U.S. national security and foreign policy analyst, has been our guest tonight. Thank you so much once again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for staying here with us at World News Tonight. Please stay tuned to TVP World for more news and continuous coverage of commentaries.